Hello to everybody. I'm very happy that you took sustainable finance as one of your key topics to be discussed, because I think that all of the sectors should be tackling the issue and starting to prepare for the requirements of sustainable finance. Sustainable finance is here to stay, and I personally believe it is one of our biggest possibilities to tackle climate change and resource efficiency challenges. The Commission work has been ongoing for 4 or 5 years already, and there's a strong support by the financial community that we would get the indicators for better understanding what are the ESG impact of the companies, what are the sustainability requirements, that is the taxonomy, and how that is reported and turned to finance decisions. All in all, I would compare it to IFRS. Think if the accounting would be voluntary. Think if there would be 20 or 200 different reporting, that is, accounting systems. What would be the comparability? You would lose the information and the impact of investors, because you couldn't be sure how to compare different initiatives, companies, and the profitability and return on the investments. So the idea of sustainable finance is to put the understanding on the impact of the companies and actions on environmental terms and metrics, as we do it in economic terms. There's of course a different kind of understanding and wishes how should we define sustainable finance. Some people think that we should only define what is sustainable, what is environmentally friendly, and then sort of label it and to give credits for those activities. The problem with this approach is that then it would touch only one part. According to estimates, 5 to 15% of the whole investment money, and it wouldn't actually make bigger changes in all industry sectors. And the problem is that if you just put the politicians to decide what is sustainable or what is the definition, not to talk about that, it would be sort of defining the technologies. You are outdated before the regulation is on place. Plus then the question is of course complicated, because if you look the impact, you shouldn't look only the climate or biodiversity or one matter. So what the Parliament's approach has been, and my advocacy and approach very strongly, that we should develop first the indicators of sustainability. And they are already there, and they are used in different kind of benchmarks, and they are used already in some parts of the investment decisions. But while they are not harmonized, there's the issue of comparability, and there's the issue of, if you would call it taxonomy, or the understanding what you should measure and how you should compare the different elements. So the indicators are actually pretty robust, according to my understanding. What would be the best choice? Firstly, what is the amount of raw materials used? What kind of raw materials? This is the information what we have pretty much already. What is the amount of energy and what kind of energy is consumed? What are the emissions and the quality and the sector of emissions? What are CO2 emissions? What is water consumption? And now we get to a bit more difficult but manageable issues. What is the biodiversity impact? Is that compensated? And then what is the indirect land use impact? That is important, as we have seen in the case of palm oil, for example. So this is what to measure. And then another issue is how to measure. And we should also harmonize in the longer run the life cycle assessment. There are some initiatives already in the Commission, but I think that we should target much better and higher ambition level. And indeed, it should be the whole cradle to grave. That means on the assessment, you should start on the first place when you put the first shovel in the mining site of the raw materials. Take into account the use time of the goods or the materials, how they are in closed loops, and then what is the end, the grave of those materials. And with that model, you actually can create the comparability between different actions. Okay, you shouldn't look only one of these impacts, you should look all of those impacts. And then what comes a bit challenging, but this is the same thing in economic profitability. It is how you actually value different elements. Should I combat climate change and then take some suffering in the biodiversity if you are not in the perfect world? Or should I enhance the long durables closed loops use of non-renewables and save biodiversity in some other places? There we are going to need a lot of analytics, there we are going to need the benchmarks and the ratings as we do have already now. But there the methods how the ratings are done should be transparent and comparable. Then the question is, what do you define to be green or black if you wish? And there I hate these kind of categorizations where you sort of start picking sectors or materials to just doom them not sustainable. Because it depends about the whole procedure and the bigger impact. And then of course the trade-offs with different kind of environmental and of course in some cases social impacts. There what we are challenged in the future is that we have to create sector-wise benchmarks. And we actually should have this kind of a continuum like we have and benchmarks like we have in economic profitability, where you judge and look different kind of industries and impacts. Because of course it would be very easy to judge energy efficiency or de-investing from fossils to electricity to be a good investment and green, but this is very limited. And then again, that requires some mining, some raw materials and some very scarce and sometimes hazardous materials also. And if we think, for example, one sort of a good example that is concrete, that is cement. The construction is about 50% of the raw material resource consumption in Europe, and concrete is a big part of it. And it causes about 40% of our climate impacts. But no one can sort of think that you couldn't think that you are going to construct or build or repair in the future. So that's why we need to have the comparability between the industries. And indeed, in the cement, in the concrete, we know that in the comparison with the best practice and the worst practice, the difference is tenfold. It is in energy efficiency, in the reuse of the resources and overall environmental impact when you look at the different sectors. So it would be extremely important to favor and grant the status of sustainable investment for those ones to be best in the class and sort of speed up the procedure from worse procedures to better procedures in industries. then we shouldn't also sort of condemn some companies, let's say in fossil sector, to be totally negative and disinvested. Because if the company can show a track record and it can show a plan that it follows, how it is going to de-invest, let's say, out of the coal mining and up to renewable energies or technologies or whatever that would be, that should be rewarded and that should be considered in that part of the investment that is put on the new part of the activity as sustainable. And then again, if you have a company who doesn't seem to be moving that much and that is in lower levels already, that then should be warned to be as risky business. And that is the reason why in the reporting, in the disclosure of sustainable finance regulation, the Parliament pushed through very strongly the principle of due diligence. The due diligence of investors to know whether their investments are moving towards this greener end, better end, or whether they are containing that kind of a risky economic risk and environmental risk investments. And it's very important to have this economic risk and environmental risk parallel. Because if we have run out of climate change, this is not very good business environment. And then again, if everybody else is disinvesting, let's say out of the coal mining, what would happen is that those investors with our pension funds that have their assets on those companies would be in big trouble. And that then, on my opinion, in the longer run, leads to the thinking that also the credit rating agencies, when they rate companies, and when they, that matter, rate countries, should rate the sustainability impact also, not only the economic, because they are in the longer run twined together. So disclosure, what we already agreed with the Council, and that is going to come up on the 4th, means that the big investors are obliged to disclose what kind of reporting method they are using. Unfortunately, we couldn't have these harmonized indicators yet, but this is work in progress during this parliamentary and commission term. And the smaller ones are encouraged to do that. There's the possibility to use that on product level and then, of course, in the whole investment set on the company level. We have the regulation about the benchmarks to come up on force that is helping the investors. And now we are working with the taxonomy. And that is sort of the mother of these other regulations, because this should be linked to these indicators and to that kind of a thinking that it is based on indicators, life cycle analysis, risk assessment, and do no harm principle. So the spillover effect should be taken into account, and that includes the social matters. And then on that basis, we would define the labeling and the understanding of green investments to start with in the future. And this process is going to start with the climate impact, but the Parliament's strong position is that we do get all the other impacts included as soon as possible because of this kind of a spillover effect or do harm consequences we want and we need to avoid. I'm very happy to continue this discussion with mining industry because we do see the need of raw materials in the future. And even though we would need to increase tenfold of resource efficiency in the use of raw materials, there's still always the need for new raw materials and mining activity. The question is how you can turn the mining to be as sustainable as possible. Closed mining, wastewater treatment, energy efficiency, renewable energy used, the biodiversity taken into account on the compensation principle. So if you take up new areas, it should be compensated in somewhere else. I know that we are not yet there, but this is the place where we need to be heading to. And this is something the politicians alone, the businesses alone, or the science alone can't solve. But I'm convinced that working together, we can find the solution, the realistic timetable, how to achieve it, and then how the sustainable finance, the metering, the labeling of green investments, and the reporting can help the industries to shift for better future. I thank you, and I'm looking forward for your comments and the very vivid discussion, and hopefully the next chance is to continue this discussion.